Thank you, Stephen. And as was mentioned, my name is Michael Umpierre, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at the McCourt School of Public Policy within Georgetown University. I want to thank the sponsors of this wonderful event for the opportunity to allowing me to speak with you today. To the leadership of John Jay College, as well as the Tao and Annie E. Casey Foundations, thank you for supporting these critically important conversations on juvenile justice. We go to juvenile justice conferences all the time as professionals in this field, and I can tell you that the conference that these folks have put together for you is really tremendous in terms of the content and the speakers that they've lined up. So kudos for establishing the fellowship and for making this convening happen. It's really important. I was asked to come today to tell you a story, and that is the story of juvenile justice reform in the last 3 decades. This includes the forces that made those juvenile justice reforms possible. This story is multifaceted, and it includes and involves multiple players, including researchers, legislators, federal, state, and local government officials, advocates, attorneys, judges, foundation officials, and, importantly, the media. While I have a limited amount of time today, and I won't be able to address every reform that's taken place over the last few decades, or every force that has contributed to make those reforms take place, I do want to make a point right off the bat, and it's something that Carol led off with, which is this. How we approach juvenile justice policy and practice in this country has profound impacts and effects on the lives of youth, families, and communities. When we think about the juvenile justice system, as you will over the course of the next 2 days, it is far too easy, and it will be far too easy, to conceptualize the system in the abstract. But we have to keep in mind that behind the data, behind the statistics, behind the narratives, are the real lives of young people who have their entire futures ahead of them. Behind these narratives and these data and these statistics are the real lives of family members and loved ones who love and support these young people, and the real lives of victims of crime and other members of the community that are impacted by our approaches. And because the stakes are exceedingly high when it comes to juvenile justice, it's critically important that we get it right. And by we, I don't just mean the officials that operate the juvenile justice systems around the country or the legislators that pass laws to advance changes to the juvenile justice or the advocates who push for reform, but by we, I mean all of you as journalists. As journalists, you each play an essential role in shaping the narrative of juvenile justice and how we characterize young people and families in the system. And at this point in time, it is arguably more important than ever that you, as journalists, ensure that you write stories and share those stories that are accurate, that are balanced, that they're based in fact, and that you appreciate the far reach that your stories can have. Because if the story that I'm about to tell you about juvenile justice reform teaches us anything, it is that the media can and does, in fact, have an impact on juvenile justice policy and practice. So I want to begin our story in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Of course, the juvenile justice system has existed in the U.S. for well over a century, starting with the establishment of the first juvenile court in Cook County, Illinois in 1899. And since its inception, the system has seen various ebbs and flows in terms of its focus and its approach. But for our purposes today, I want to narrow our focus on the events of the late 1980s and early 1990s. This was an incredibly challenging period for the juvenile justice field, primarily because during this time, there was a notable increase in violent juvenile crime nationally, and juvenile homicides in particular. The increase in crime was covered heavily by the media, which focused on high-profile and sensationalized cases, school shootings, gang murders, drive-by shootings, and the like. The result was a legitimate public concern regarding community safety. And in response to this increase in violent crime and to the narratives that were taking place, researchers and policymakers scrambled to identify the causes for those spikes and the solutions to them. Now, in retrospect, when we look back at what happened in the 90s, we know that the rates of violent juvenile crime actually began to drop in the mid-90s, a decline that would continue for decades afterwards. But despite this data, despite this reality that the crime rates were dropping, legislators and other government officials responded to this approach by moving away from the hallmark of what the juvenile justice was about, which is about rehabilitation and therapeutic approaches, and towards a model that featured punishment and a more traditional correctional type approach. The mantra during this time was adult time for adult crime. And as a result, what we began to see in this country was a slew of legislative policy and practice changes that featured harsher treatment and harsher penalties for system-involved youth. One of the most significant changes in this respect was the expansion of laws that facilitated the transfer of young people into adult criminal court. What that means is that young people were transferred to adult court to be charged, to be detained, to be tried, and to be sentenced as adults. This included laws that expanded the list of crimes that were eligible for such transfer, that created judicial presumptions that allowed transfer to happen, that created direct file legislation, which essentially allowed prosecutors the discretion to charge youth as adults for certain offenses. Nationally, during this time, we also saw an increase in harsher sentences or dispositions that judges were issuing for youth. For the most serious offenses, we saw the numbers of young people who were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole increase. We saw longer periods of incarceration. Overall, rates of detention and incarceration for youth in the system peaked during this time. And according to data from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, in 1997, more than 116,000 young people in this country were locked up in detention and incarceration facilities. Today, that number is about half of that, or less. So we've been on this road of declining in terms of our rates of incarceration since then. That's part of this story. In part, this sea change with respect to juvenile justice in the 90s that swung the pendulum towards punishment and this corrective approach was driven by a false narrative that was espoused by a group of researchers whose perspectives only fanned the fears of the public. These individuals, like Princeton professor John DiIulio and criminologist James Fox, characterized youth offenders during this time as super predators. Here is an excerpt from one of DiIulio's writings on the topic from 1996. Now keep in mind, in 1996, we already had the evidence that juvenile crime was going down. DiIulio and his colleagues wrote in 96, quote, "Based on all that we have witnessed, researched, and heard from people who are close to the action, here is what we believe. America is now home to thickening ranks of juvenile super predators, radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters, including ever more pre-teenage boys who murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, join gun-toting gangs, and create serious communal disorders." James Fox, for his part, also made predictions for the fate of the country at the hands of these so-called super predators, infamously saying that, quote, "Unless we act today, we're going to have a bloodbath when these kids grow up." This was the narrative that was taking place during this time. Of course, as we know now, and as I stated earlier, these predictions about juvenile crime were completely wrong. And in fact, both DiIulio and Fox and others have subsequently acknowledged that they were wrong to label youth in the way that they did, and they were wrong to make the predictions that they did. But unfortunately for the youth and families who are still involved in our systems today, the impact of that super predator myth continues. After all, it was a myth that was perpetuated by the media narratives and that was acted upon in legislative changes, changes that are very difficult to undo or to scale back. Now, so far, the story that I've told you with respect to what we experienced during this time is rather bleak. But of course, the whole function of this gathering is to talk about how we have progressed during that time. And that's the good news. Since the 1990s, the juvenile justice system has undergone a movement, a series of critically important reforms that are returning us to that rehabilitative therapeutic model that the juvenile justice system was always intended to be. It's returning us to a model that the research shows will lead to better outcomes for young people, for families, and for communities. Now, while scholars' perspectives may differ regarding how the system has been reformed during this time and to what extent, I want to highlight for you all one central theme of these reforms that in my mind really captures the heart of what has happened in the decades since the 90s, and that is the developmental approach. I believe that the most prominent shift from the punitive era of the 1990s has been the widely accepted proposition that juvenile justice policies and practices must be developmentally appropriate. At its core, this developmental approach embodies a recognition that adolescents in particular are fundamentally different than adults and also different than younger children. Research in the realms of brain development and cognitive development and psychosocial development teaches us that adolescents in particular differ from adults and children in that they're much more susceptible to peer pressure. They're much less able to regulate behavior and control impulses, particularly in emotionally charged situations, and they're much more likely to focus on immediate rewards as opposed to thinking about the long-term consequences of their actions. Today, there is wide, but I would say not universal, acceptance that this research really should inform the way that we design our juvenile justice system moving forward. All across the country, we have seen at Georgetown, at our perch, our national perch, we have seen many examples of how this developmental approach is taking hold in communities from around the country. Whether it's regular staff training on brain development and adolescent development and youth development, whether it's service delivery models that focus on training young people around skill development, particularly those really essential psychosocial skills, whether it's the importance of connecting young people to pro-social, positive, caring adults that we know from the research makes all the difference in the world. Whether it's legislative efforts to prevent status offenses and other normative behaviors from being the reason that we bring young people to the formal court system in the first place, or to penetrate them deeper into the system. Some of those matters that Carol was referencing earlier as well. We've seen legislative changes, repealing or scaling back all of the work that was done around adult transfer. And you'll hear throughout the course of these next 2 days more about that particular issues. And we've also seen laws that have expanded the age of criminal court jurisdiction. And again, I think that will be a focus of your discussions here. So the point is that there are many examples around the country where we are acting upon this research, telling us that young people are different, and that we have to, not lose our focus on accountability and public safety, but recognizing that differences matter in our policy and practice. And two symbolic events in our recent history really stand out for me as indicating this widespread acceptance of the need of embracing this developmental approach. The first is that beginning in 2005 and in the years to follow, the United States Supreme Court, in its jurisprudence on the juvenile death penalty and its jurisprudence on cases of life without the possibility of parole, recognized and relied upon the research that was done on youth development. Now, you're going to hear from Marcia and Kim and Michael in a few minutes on this, so I won't steal their thunder on this in terms of the legal reforms. But suffice it to say that it was a watershed moment in our field when the Supreme Court is citing research on youth development. Secondly, in 2013, the National Research Council of the National Academies published a seminal body of work on the developmental approach that I believe will continue to inform juvenile justice practice for years to come. The publication is titled Reforming Juvenile Justice, a Developmental Approach, which sets forth the history of juvenile justice as well as the research telling us why it is critically important that we move in this direction of a developmental approach. If you have not read it, I encourage you to pick up a copy as soon as possible. It is a seminal piece of work, and I will note that leaders from John Jay, as well as other folks in this room, contributed to the development of that publication. It really makes the case for why we need to move in this direction. Now, I want to be clear that in the 90s, since the 90s, there have been multiple other reforms that have taken place within juvenile justice that continue to have an impact today. This includes the extensive body of work around moving away from relying on detention and incarceration as a primary strategy and towards one that really embraces a community-based approach, community-based services and programs. These efforts, such as Annie E. Casey Foundation's groundbreaking Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative work, are grounded in the research indicating that you can actually do a lot of harm by taking a low-risk youth and putting them in a high-risk setting. We also are informed by evidence suggesting that we do much better when we keep young people in their home communities, as opposed to sending them away where they're disconnected from their natural support networks. This data, again, and these efforts, the fruit of this labor, we're beginning to see it in the way that we have moved away from the use of detention and incarceration. Those data points that I've mentioned, that the cuts in the use of placement really tells us that we're on the right direction. But I think that many would argue that we have a lot more work to be done to get those rates even further down. Other reforms since the 1990s include the concerted efforts by advocates and foundations and others to raise awareness and address the disproportionality and disparities faced by youth of color in this system. Again, another point that Carol led off with. This work, again, led by organizations like Annie E. Casey and the Center for Children's Law and Policy and the Burns Institute, has been nothing short of heroic, getting systems to focus on essential data strategies to make sure that we're tracking those disparities and creating solutions to address them, focusing on training around implicit bias and cultural responsiveness. These are the types of efforts that have taken place. And yet, just like the other areas that I've described, including the developmental approach, there is more work to be done. Despite all of the progress that we have seen since the 90s in the areas that I've described, this issue of racial and ethnic disparities continues to plague youth of color at every stage of the system, from arrest to charging to adjudication to disposition and beyond. So we have to continue our efforts there. And finally, I want to acknowledge the reform efforts that have focused on the need for prioritizing family engagement and family empowerment in the juvenile justice system. We are seeing more and more systems recognizing that families play an essential role in the juvenile justice process and must have a meaningful seat at the table. So systems are reshaping their efforts around case planning to make sure that families have a voice. They're providing services not only to young people, but also to families directly so that their needs can be met. We're seeing families become more and more involved in system improvement efforts. But again, another area that needs additional work, but an area that is supported by the research. We know that when families are involved and engaged, we're much more likely to see positive outcomes. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place that we're embracing the developmental approach and all of these other efforts? How did we move from a punitive era of the 90s to where we are today? In my view, in the 2000s and continuing on into this decade, there was an alignment of stars that provided an ideal setting for the juvenile justice reforms that we have seen. And in my mind, this perfect storm, if you will, included at least three critical dimensions. The first was an increasing body of knowledge of what works and what doesn't to protect public safety and achieve positive outcomes. The second was a financial environment that forced juvenile justice systems to consider cost-effective strategies. And the third was the relentless efforts of advocates and foundations and attorneys and government officials and legislators and others, including the media, to ensure the best possible outcomes for youth, families, and communities. So let me offer a bold proposition for you all as we talk about juvenile justice, as you'll explore these issues over the next 2 days. We know more today about what works in juvenile justice to protect public safety and achieve positive outcomes than ever before in history. Our body of knowledge in juvenile justice is deep and it is sophisticated, and it is supported by a cadre of researchers who have dedicated their careers to studying juvenile justice for the betterment of youth, families, and communities. There are numerous examples of research studies that have emerged since this era in the 90s that have helped to pave the path away from that correctional approach and towards one that really values the therapeutic and the developmental piece. I talked about earlier the brain research and the cognitive research led by individuals like Lawrence Steinberg, Elizabeth Kaufman, Ed Mulvey, Jennifer Woolard, and others. John Jay's very own Jeff Butts has contributed, and his colleagues have contributed significantly to this body of work by offering a framework around positive youth justice, really pulling from the research of youth development. Several systems are using that framework to guide their work today. Other researchers like Mark Lipsey have sought to answer the question, what are the characteristics of an effective juvenile justice program? And in 2010, Lipsey and his colleagues actually looked at a meta-analysis of more than 500 studies of juvenile justice programs to ask the question, what works? And in looking at those 500-plus studies, what Lipsey and others found was that programs that espoused a therapeutic philosophy, that prioritized skill development, that prioritized relationship building, that looked at restorative justice, that those measures, those programs were significantly more effective at reducing recidivism and protecting public safety than approaches that relied on surveillance, control, and fear and deterrence. The classic programs that we think about in the 90s that really gained steam are programs like boot camps or Scared Straight. Many of you may be familiar with those programs. We know now that those programs that are rooted in those efforts of fear or control simply do not work. And again, that is a testament to the research that has taken place in our field. Now, it would be an incomplete story if I said to you that the researchers did this alone, because the reality is that researchers need support to do the work that they do. And so I would argue that the entities that have supported these researchers in our field also played a huge role in advancing the field. So 2 entities really come to mind here in terms of supporting research. One is the federal government. In response to the spike in crime in the early 90s, in 1994, Congress passed the largest crime bill in the history of the United States. In many respects, the provisions of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 reflected the punitive responses that marked that era. It was a very controversial piece of legislation at the time. Among other things, the legislation increased funding for the development of prisons. It expanded the federal death penalty, created a whole host of new offenses that could bring young people and families and others into the justice system. But one of the positive things that happened with this piece of legislation was that it greatly increased the budget of the Department of Justice, including the Office of Justice Programs, which oversees the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And what that meant with this increased budget, and we're talking about to the tune of millions and millions of dollars, was that OJP was able to direct that funding to support research and evaluation that ultimately led to the development of this knowledge base. So when we think about the forces going forward, we have to ask, what is the role of the federal government in supporting juvenile justice moving forward? The second set of entities that I would highlight here that really played a critical role is the foundation world. Foundations like Tao and Annie E. Casey and others for years have been investing in these research initiatives, as well as other efforts that are designed to lift up promising practices in this field. I want you all to know, for those of you who may be entering the juvenile justice field, getting to know more about it, over the years, we have a cluster of foundations that have supported this work in tremendous ways. A couple of the foundations are reflected in the room today, but there are others. I won't name them all because I'll inevitably leave one out. But it's just a significant body of foundations. Now, like in the federal government context, in the foundation world, the focus of foundations also ebbs and flows. So a question for all of us moving forward in supporting these reforms is, what will be the continued role of the foundations moving forward? I do want to note here that one of the foundations, particularly with respect to what I've said about the developmental approach, one of the foundations, the MacArthur Foundation, in the mid-90s actually created what they called a research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice. And basically what it was a network of researchers from all around the country who ultimately produced the seminal studies that the Supreme Court cited in their jurisprudence and that you'll hear about more in just a little bit. So the second overarching dimension or force that led to this juvenile justice, the where we are today, in my view, is this financial environment that we saw in the 2000s. Beginning in the early 2000s and peaking in 2008 when we experienced that economic recession, that great recession, the financial environment during the decade placed extreme burdens on youth-serving agencies all around the country. The budgets of juvenile justice agencies and courts were slashed across the board. And so partners and officials had to figure out, how do we do more with less? And again, here, this is where the research on juvenile justice played an important role in demonstrating that the punitive measures of the 90s, including detention and incarceration, not only led to worse outcomes, but they were incredibly costly. Researchers generated cost-benefit analyses of programs and approaches that were especially informative. Notable here is the Washington State Institute for Public Policy that publicized a series of cost-benefit analyses on particular juvenile justice programs and services. So earlier I talked about Scared Straight. So part of what the Washington State Institute does is it looks at, if we put in $1 into programs like Scared Straight, what is the return? The most recent data that I've seen, and you all can see it because it's made publicly available on their website, the most recent data indicates that if we put $1 into Scared Straight, we're going to lose $100 in return. Whereas if we invest in a program or an approach like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based program that is widely used in juvenile justice, if we put in $1, we're actually going to get a return, a benefit of $38, that being the most recent data. Okay, so let me just wrap up, Joe, and then I'll come back to you. So what is interesting about this conversation is that, about costs and benefits, is that it's a conversation that's taken place across all sides of the political spectrum. It's allowed both liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats and independents to come together to have a conversation about the importance of being smart on crime. And then finally, I'll wrap up by saying the third dimension that led to the reforms, as I mentioned, were the tireless efforts of advocates and others. You're going to hear from folks all around the country that have done this work over the course of decades, but suffice it to say that we have an incredible body of advocates, attorneys, and others who have led this system. So, as I close, I just want to say one thing. I appreciate that the title of this conference is Unfinished Business, because in my view, the story on juvenile justice is not completely written. We have a lot more work to be done, and threats to the progress seemingly always loom. And the role that you all have as journalists is an important one, a critical one, in terms of how you tell the stories moving forward. How the partners and the stakeholders and you all as the media will shape the narrative will have an impact on the way that the story unfolds. how these reforms ultimately, how history will look at these reforms. And there will be no one who is more invested in how that story unfolds than the young people and families and community of members that are impacted by our daily practice and approaches. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
So thank you, Michael. I know we have, you want to rush off, so we have time for a limited number of questions. So raise your hands, make it a question, and say who you are because we're recording.
Hi, my name is Suzette Brewer. I'm a writer covering federal Indian law and the Supreme Court in Indian country. And I'm curious, just real quickly, can we get a copy of your remarks? Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then my next question is, when we talk about the issues of the mid-'90s, I just want to make sure I am understanding my take on the data that you're discussing really impacted communities of color perhaps more than any other group. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And that's why it's essential that when we're having these conversations, particularly the conversations that are in the national discourse now about the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, the impact of race and ethnicity is incredible. And from a research perspective, we know for young people in the system that perceptions of fairness are actually connected to outcomes. We know that if kids perceive our systems to be fair, they're much more likely to engage in the type of services that we want them to. They're much more likely to respect system officials and to build that level of trust and relationship. So for me, addressing racial and ethnic disparities and focusing on these issues is not just the right thing to do, but it's actually going to lead to better outcomes in the long term.
We'll post your remarks online as well. Next question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Art Levine. I'm a freelancer with Juvenile Justice Information Exchange and also an author of this book, Mental Health Incorporated. My question is, as we move to the therapeutic and behavioral and developmental models, what is the juvenile justice reform community doing to make sure that the alternatives on the ground are keeping fidelity to those models? Because the University of California, Colorado Center for Study of Prevention Violence says there's like 1,400 programs out there claiming to be delivering the goods, but only about 5% in the research deliver the goods, and much less than those 5% on the ground actually show fidelity to what the research showed. So what is the juvenile justice community going to be doing about that as we move towards these therapeutic models?
It's a great question, and it's a consistent challenge. We have, you can have the best research in the world focusing on evidence-based programs, but if they're not implemented as intended, then the integrity of the approach falls apart. And so you're right to be focusing on implementation. That is at the heart of what we do at Georgetown when we're working with government systems and agencies, is to think about ways to not only measure the efficacy of their work, because it's important to share that story with the public about, if we're going to be making these investments with the precious resources that we have to be demonstrating the results. But in order to do that, we have to be focused on implementation, and what that means is making sure that you've got strong policies in place, that you've got strong training in place, that you've got quality assurance measures that look at both process outcomes but also ultimate outcomes as well. So you're right to bring up that as an issue. I would say it's a consistent challenge that we need to continue to address in the field.
We can do two more questions.
I'm from San Diego, and one of the big issues, and I'm sure this is an issue elsewhere, is parents not coming to visit their children. And one reason, at least in San Diego, is because a lot of these parents are undocumented, or maybe someone in their family is undocumented, and they feel that our largest facility is right near the border and right near the federal immigration detention facility. So they're terrified of going there. Is there any talk about, I know that they're trying to do video meetings with their kids, but any other ideas for situations like that?
Yeah. So I can tell you that when it comes to family engagement, we know, particularly in the facility context, and I think that you're referring to the East Mesa facility in San Diego. We've done some work there. But when it comes to family engagement, we know, particularly in the facility context, there actually have been studies that show the number of contacts that a young person receives when they're in placement actually impacts their academic progress while they're in the facility, as well as their behavior while in the facility. So the Vera Institute of Justice looked at this in Ohio, and they wanted to know, the kids who get visited and have that level of engagement from their families, are they better off? And in fact, the answer is yes. So we know, and this is just one example, we know across the board that family engagement is absolutely critical. So when we think about family engagement, it's a few things. One is, how can we broaden the definition of families so that we don't just think about those that are related via blood or through marriage? The reality of young people who touch our systems is that they come from different family structures. And it's our job to make sure that we're identifying the full network of supporters, that fictive kin, whether it's the mentor or positive peer or adult or members of the clergy. So at a starting point, part of the solution is we have to have a broad sense of what family, how we're defining family, and then we have to be putting resources to make sure that we're sending the message that families are valued and that we're giving them the resources that they need in order to facilitate those connections. I will very briefly just highlight one other point here. The message to families historically in juvenile justice has been that you as families are part of the problem. And where we have to move in the field is that families are part of the solution. In fact, they're the essential part of the solution. They're the experts on their children, and they know their young people the best. So some jurisdictions have been very forward-thinking about this and very in terms of sending the message to families that we will not judge you because of the system involvement, but we will work with you and empower you. So I think what you're describing is, what can you do around transportation? What can you do around video conferencing to facilitate that engagement? And then what can you do around staff training to make sure that we're engaging families in a strength-based way? But there's a lot more to unpack, more than I can get into in the limited time that I've got. But great question.
So one more quick one. Jonah.
Hi, Michael Fitzgerald with the Chronicle of Social Change. Sorry. I'll just shout it.
That was a showstopper.
We cover foster care as well and child
Absolutely.
welfare in addition to juvenile justice. So I'm wondering, how have you seen the relationship? I know I saw in your bio that you've done some work also on that side of things,
Yes.
foster care. So how have you seen the relationship between those two systems change as this developmental approach has emerged and gotten pretty widespread in the juvenile justice system?
Great question.
Everybody hear that question?
Yes.
I don't know if you want
Yeah, so basically getting to the fact that you have the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system, and then oftentimes the population that we're talking about are the same kids. And so how has child welfare and juvenile justice worked together to support this developmental approach? Let me say this. The research on what is known as the crossover youth, this population of young people that are involved in child welfare, whether they've been abused or neglected, and then subsequently are involved in the juvenile justice system for delinquency matters. What we know is that young people who are abused and neglected or in the child welfare system are significantly more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. And so part of our work at Georgetown really is about how do we get systems to collaborate with each other? Because traditionally what we have seen is that child welfare works in its own silo, and juvenile justice works in its own silo, and we're talking about the same population of youth. And there are many lessons that we can learn from child welfare, and there are many lessons that child welfare can learn from juvenile justice. So part of what we've done, we developed what we call the crossover youth practice model, and we've implemented it in over 100 communities around the country. And it's basically a set of best practices for serving this population of youth that are duly involved in child welfare and juvenile justice. And as part of that, we have the conversation about what does it mean to collaborate, what does it mean to communicate across systems, because that is really the next, I think, frontier of juvenile justice as well, is thinking about this in a broad sense. We can't always look to juvenile justice to solve every problem. It has to be a collective approach. We think about our partners in child welfare, we think about our partners in education and behavioral health, across the board. It has to be a multi-system effort, and that in many ways is at the heart of what we do at the center. So thanks for the question.